Hello, everyone. Very welcome to this launch of the business brief, the GEO for Business briefing note. My name is Corley Pretorius, and I am Deputy Director of UN Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre, that is UNEP-WCMC for short. Very pleased to welcome you to this session today. We are going to talk a little bit about how UNEP delivers and provides input to different parts of our society in terms of its core mandate to keep the environment under review. And one of the ways that we deliver on this is through the Global Environment Outlook process, and we've done this since 1995. We develop these outlooks, then also tailor it for different interest groups, and one of the interest groups that we are engaging in this process is, of course, the business community, a key change agent in our societies. Now, GEO for Business is a co-creation process, and it's meant to be written by business voices in order to speak to a business audience. And it's talking about the types of systemic transformations that are needed between now and 2050 to ensure that we have environmentally, socially, and economically sustainable future. These business series helps to identify opportunities for the private sector to collaborate in achieving a nature positive and a circular economy. In this way, it also links to and advance the Agenda 2030 and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. In the GEO for Business process, we provide opportunities for business to collaborate in developing plans, business strategies, technology pathways, risk assessment mechanisms, and enablers to build this nature positive future. The business brief that we are launching today is entitled The Role of Business in Transforming Food Systems. Hugely timely launch of the briefing note. As you know, we have the Food Systems Summit being scheduled and hosted out of New York next week, in exactly a week's time. And you may have also noted the huge number of reports and recommendations that's coming out on the transformation of the food systems. One of the reports that were launched earlier this week was launched by the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, UNDP, and UNEP, and that was on repurposing agricultural support. Lots of discussion, lots of momentum, mobilization around the transformation of our food systems. I'm very pleased to welcome UNEP's Deputy Executive Director, Joyce Masuya, to provide the opening remarks. Always welcome your insights and your perspectives on such an important topic where UNEP has also played a very big role in providing input into the preparatory process for the Food Systems Summit. After the opening remarks, I'm going to introduce our panelists, but please, Joyce, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Corley, for a very kind introduction. And I also want to recognize the panelists. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am delighted to see so many of you here today virtually. The launch of this brief on the role of businesses in food systems comes at an important moment. Science has shown us that the way humanity produces and consumes food is simply unsustainable. It is propelling climate change, driving pollution, and biodiversity loss. But your presence here today is cause for hope. It is a clear sign that the business community and public sector alike understand the gravity of this issue. That's good because the scale of the challenge ahead of us is immense. Without question, the industrial production of food has helped combat hunger and nourish a fast-growing global population. But we've reached the point where our food systems are taking too heavy a toll on people and the planet. The facts and figures I'm about to share give us all a pause for thought. We have managed to create a global food system in which both hunger and waste are rampant. Worldwide, over 800 million people were undernourished in 2020, while UNEP found that over 17% of all the world's food is simply thrown away. The food we waste is not feeding the hungry, but it is feeding climate change, accounting for up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock farming is another driver of climate change, accounting for 13% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Pesticides and fertilizers are sapping soils of their natural nutrients and leaving dead zones in our rivers, streams, and oceans. Current farming methods are degrading soil 100 times faster than new soil is formed. That is according to the IMF. The almost insatiable demand for farmland is destroying ecosystems and wildlife habitats. One of the reasons 1 million species are headed for extinction. The biodiversity loss also extends to plants. Over the past century, more than 90% of crop varieties have disappeared. Today, just 3 crops, rice, maize, and wheat, supply 60% of the world's dietary energy. The reason all of this matters is because a stable climate, pollution-free planet, and biodiversity are the foundations of human well-being. Without them, we cannot survive or prosper. This is as true for businesses as it is for anything else. Business success depends on productive natural systems and supply chains. As the world's population grows, by 2050, food demand is set to increase by more than 50%. This is where businesses have an opportunity and a responsibility. The private sector can help steer the economy and our food system towards a new model of sustainability. There is tremendous opportunity for those who take up this challenge, who dare to explore, to experiment, and to collaborate. But, and I want to be very clear here, for businesses who fail to transform, perils lie ahead. As environmental, social, and governance issues gain global urgency, companies that fail to integrate sustainability into their operations will find it more difficult to remain competitive and attract finance and consumers. So what can businesses do? Firstly, they can encourage partners across their supply chains to use farming techniques that value and restore biodiversity and land health. Secondly, they can rebalance their product portfolios, introducing plant-rich foods which are less destructive to the environment. Thirdly, food producers can develop targets to limit food waste. Fourthly, they can align their business with the Sustainable Development Goals, humanity's blueprint for a better future. Finally, firms can quantify the benefits that nature brings to their business using systems of natural capital accounting. Most of these steps are not complicated and can have a huge impact on the environment. Sustainable agriculture, for example, creates 64% fewer greenhouse gas emissions per hectare. Before I close, let me reiterate what I began with. We find ourselves at a very opportune moment. This month, the UN Secretary General is convening the Food System Summit to drive the dialogue, policy, and commitments we need to transform food systems. The private sector has a vital role to play. Businesses that embrace sustainable practices, that work with nature, reduce waste, and encourage circularity will be hailed as the pioneers of the new economy. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joyce. Message loud and clear. Thank you also for giving an overview of those staggering statistics. And it's really, the food system is really an enormous global system, and it crosses so many of our sectors in society. And it's really about those interlinkages between the biophysical systems, the economic systems, and the social systems. And as you say, there's not only a recognition of the urgency to act, but increasingly also around the opportunity to act. So I think that is a very good note to start with our conversation with our panelists, and I can introduce them. First is Andy Griffiths, and Andy is the head of value chain sustainability for Nestlé's UK and Ireland businesses. Andy is also lead author of The Business Brief. Next, Hassan Gombe. Hassan is a resilience officer at the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, commonly known as AGRA, and coordinating lead author of The Business Brief. And then finally, great pleasure to introduce Ruth Thomas. And Ruth is the Director, Equitable Livelihoods at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And the Business Council has played an active role in engaging companies in a number of these socioeconomic transformations. But if I can start with you, Andy, please. Businesses, as Joyce has also said, businesses have a crucial role to play in enabling this transformation, regardless of their size or their role in the global food system. By acting now, significant opportunities to deliver business value can be realized. What are some of the positive business impacts you have seen from transforming to more sustainable value chains within Nestlé or across your sector?
Thanks for asking the question, Corley, and a real pleasure to be here today. I think in terms of the question, just reflecting on some of the comments that Joyce made, there are some really significant opportunities for those businesses who do lean into the challenge and really focus on how they can help accelerate this transformation. First one would be around resilience. So by leaning into the challenge and really helping to drive a nature positive food system or food systems, then it delivers a number of outcomes from a resilience perspective. The first one is in terms of the resiliency of our supply chain. Our food systems are large, complex, and very interconnected. And it can make it difficult to understand and track how those food systems operate. So what's really important is that we have resiliency within those food systems. And with the challenge we're facing into in terms of climate change and the decline in nature, the resiliency of supply is heavily challenged. So by focusing on how we can build those solutions, those nature positive or regenerative solutions, working with farmers, land managers, in terms of adapting their practices, we can build that resilience and ensure that as businesses, we have confidence in the future supply of the ingredients and products that we rely on. Also, as part of that, it also provides more certainty in terms of cost as well. So two really core elements for business. Also, many of our customers ultimately sit within those communities within which we operate. So again, it builds increased awareness, understanding, linkage back to where our food comes from, and increased engagement and understanding around the food system. Mm-hmm. The second area is reduction. So really looking at reductions in cost and waste within the operations. So by focusing on, for example, food loss and waste, seen as the biggest lever by drawdown in terms of actually managing climate change or addressing climate change. But actually, from a business perspective, it takes real cost out of business. The more you can reduce your own waste streams, the more money you can save. But also, by reducing the pressure on the food system, by avoiding the need to draw through more product to effectively cover that waste, then again, the more certainty we have in supply and the more effectively you can manage costs within that supply network. And then thirdly, relevance. So at the end of the day, and this fits very well with some of Joyce's closing comments, for us as businesses to be relevant to both, the people who finance us, who fund us, but also really importantly to our customers, we need to ensure that we're driving change. And we need, if you look at the younger generations coming through, they see the challenges that we're facing in terms of environment and social challenges, and expect businesses to be delivering against that. And for those businesses who don't, your business models are at high risk of becoming irrelevant, and therefore your business strategies are at risk.
by covering resilience, cost, and relevance, you also really working across the different divisions of the company.
Absolutely, yeah. We've seen this within our own business. Yeah, perhaps initially people have an expectation that it's the sustainability professionals who will lead the charge and deliver all the outcomes. But the reality is, to drive this kind of transition, we need everyone within the organization to engage. It affects everyone's roles and also how they engage with other partners across the value chain. So that's where we can help leverage value, not just by delivering change within our own business, but helping other actors across the food chain to deliver change as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I want to pick up on the point around resilience, because I think this is very relevant to dealing and coping with climate change and climate adaptation. We've also seen in our work that one part of the equation of becoming more sustainable is around impacts, but the other part is really managing your dependencies on ecosystem services, for example, and managing your resilience to climate change and sort of bringing in adaptation into that equation. So maybe if I can ask Hassan, why is food system transformation important to climate adaptation, and what are the interlinkages that's at play here?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Corey. Thanks. Inspiring words, but also very.
We're missing. We only hearing you intermittently, so there's a little bit of a sort of either a delay or something on the sound or something. Yeah, now we hear you.
Sure, whether is that better? Mm-hmm. It's probably something to do with activity. I'm so sorry about it. But just jumping straight into the issue of climate change adaptation and the two are very intricately linked. From what Joyce has said earlier on, how food systems contribute to climate, but as well as how much they are causing inequality within communities. Climate change is a real issue, and how we produce food, how we store it, how we use it, how we consume it is a big issue in terms of how we adaptation issues around climate. From the productivity side, for example, we need to build into our food systems that will encourage nature, regeneration within the production systems. We need to build in efficiencies within the value chain processes that allow us to energy, allow us to reduce waste, and thereby building resilience of communities and value chain actors across the. Sometimes when you think about transformation processes and you look at climate change adaptation, it's very difficult to separate the two of them, because it's all about building in mechanisms in our communities, be it business and social, to be able to deal with the challenge.
Mm-hmm. Picking up on the social dimension, and you mentioned inequalities also, how can, through the sustainable or regenerative agricultural practices, we can also build the resilience of rural livelihoods?
Yeah, very interesting question you raise. The productivity of our rural communities links a lot to the issue of resilience. And I pick from, the work that we do and what we've seen in the past, picking on the issue of the rural urban migration. I thought people are moving from the rural areas mainly because their productivity is getting lower and lower. And we link that to issues of our environment, where our soils are giving us that. And people in the rural areas generally feel they need to move to urban cities to be able to make a living. And that creates a problem in the rural areas in terms of how they are able to cope with issues, their livelihood. So by building to our food transformation that generate our environment is a way in which we are building economies for them to be stronger. It will create an incentive for people to stay within communities for businesses to invest in these communities because they are more productive, and for technology transfer as well, to build these rural economies into that's able to cope and develop and provide options for people to stay and live comfortable lives in these areas. And by doing that, we're actually building a resilient system in the community to be able to cope with the shocks and stresses that they affect them.
That's a great way to frame the sort of productivity of agricultural and environmental systems to livelihoods, and then how it links also to resilience and to migration. So thank you very much for that. I want to pick up on exactly that resilience issue and the inequality issue and when I move to Ruth also, and talk about sort of equity and equitable livelihoods. So how can we also, in the transformation of the agricultural or food systems, think about doing good, addressing inequalities specifically?
Thanks for the question, Cooley, and really great to be here. Thanks for the invitation and to sit alongside some such valued partners. It's going to be a great discussion, I'm sure. I think it's just quite extraordinary how much traction the equitable livelihood, social justice agenda is getting within the food system discourse. And very, very welcome, and of course, very, very urgent. In fact, I noticed that 2 out of the 7 impacts identified in your own GEO for Business brief speak specifically to the social agenda, which is a further kind of indication of that. Really important, particularly for a sector which I think it's probably fair to say has largely been dominated by the environment discourse to date. So, you know, recognizing that particularly now, as well as we recover from or still go through the global pandemic, just how much inequality is growing, just how much work we have to do if we have any chance of collectively meeting SDG 1 and 2 on zero hunger and no poverty. So really very timely. I think partly what the food system conversation is enabling us to do is really join the dots for the first time. As we search forwards for a way to provide sustainable healthy diets for 9 billion people in 2050, between water scarcity, poverty alleviation, climate change, nature loss, and nutrition, in a way that we haven't been able to and haven't had the opportunity before. Indeed, like WBCSD's Vision 2050 actually puts inequality alongside nature loss and climate change as one of the 3 most pressing global agendas. The Action Track 4 leadership group of the Food System Summit, which I have until recently been a member of, also called out that, of course, a food system that isn't equitable isn't sustainable. So I think all these are very encouraging signs in a system where 2 out of 3 adults living in poverty are food producers. So I guess, you know, what does it mean in practice? How can a sustainable food system actually build and strengthen equitable livelihoods? We have done quite a bit of work on this through our CEO guide and through the roadmap that we published. Certainly the focus on equitable livelihoods at WBCSD at the moment focuses very much on increasing access to markets and finance for small farmers and for agri-SMEs, on strengthening human rights policy and practice with a spotlight on women and youth and land tenure, and of course on inclusive innovation and tech. And it was great to see also food loss and waste called out specifically in the business brief. One of our member companies did some work recently on their smallholder rice value chains in Nigeria and quantified that actually farmers are losing up to the equivalent of $500 a year because they didn't have access to some basic storage facilities to their, for their rice. So I think that again kind of underpins the importance of acting on food loss and waste. Something else that I'm sure we'll get further into the discussion is the need for us collectively to build living incomes and wages as a foundation to enable equitable livelihoods, i.e. to enable a decent standard of living. And that has been a dominant discussion within the food system summit discourse. We actually co-convened a plenary session at the pre-food system summit on that topic, supported by a couple of member states. And we are putting together with IFAD and ILO and IDH and many, many others, together a coalition of action to address the living incomes and wages challenge, which will call out very specific areas where companies can really add value. Anything from establishing and sharing baselines to getting better data on what living incomes and wages are and how to fill those gaps, and on corporate performance, on areas that impact incomes and wages, and on, of course, providing technical services and upskilling for small farmers and SMEs. But I'll just pause there now for Corley and see where you want to go.
Fantastic answer. And you traversed half of the food system, touching on jobs, health, consumption, sustainable lifestyles, but also real inequality issues around access to food, nutrition, living incomes. And these are all parts that exactly shows how complex on the one hand and interconnected many of our food system is. And there's really a role for so many parts of our business community or our retailers, but also as individual consumers to play in thinking about how we transform the food system. So thank you very much, Ruth, for that answer and linking to those subject areas. Much appreciated. I'm going to go back to Andrew or Andy in terms of one of the key areas of transformation that was highlighted in the business brief is around nature positive production. And sort of thinking again about your value chains, your supply chains, what are some of the steps that businesses more generally can take? Where do you start? Or, how do you accelerate? I don't want to work on the or create the impression that we are only starting now. I think there's been great transformation already in the food system, but how do we accelerate? How do we scale? How can businesses take the leap and into these new processes, latching onto those?
Yes, there's a few areas. I think the first one is really for businesses to understand, and both Hassan and Ruth touched on this earlier, their dependencies on nature and the environment and on the different actors within the value chain. Once they understand that, it's much easier to plot a course and prioritize actions within that strategic roadmap. So that's really important. There's a risk that we jump in blind and we focus on, flavor of the day or what seems to be the more obvious driver. By looking at dependencies, it enables us to take much more of a systems-based approach and methodical approach and really optimize both the scale of impact that we can have, but also the efficiency of that impact as well. Then once you've understood that and the opportunity to align those against the SDGs, it's a great framework that you can hang that around. Then really start thinking about the specific opportunities. And as I touched on earlier, the food system is really complex and it can be difficult for businesses to understand. So where do I start? But I think what we've tried to do in the GEO report is really call out some core opportunities, almost no regrets opportunities where businesses can step in, take action now without necessarily fully understanding how the other bits fit together. First one is food loss and waste. It's such an easy win, the opportunity to drive significant impact from a climate perspective, but also reducing the load or demand on land use, on water use, as well is significant. For businesses, it helps take cost out of the system. And if you're looking at surplus redistribution as well, then the opportunity to help feed those who are struggling perhaps to feed themselves. So a real opportunity to leverage food loss and waste. And like I said, it's a triple win. It delivers for the environment, it delivers for society, and it absolutely delivers for business by taking cost out of the operation. Second area is that transition towards more nutritious and plant-based diets. Clearly, livestock and dairy are important, and we shouldn't be divisive about this. They have a key role or can play a key role within regenerative agriculture in terms of the natural systems. I won't go into the specifics of this call, but the opportunities to really kind of bring that to life, but clearly the opportunities to leverage more plant-rich diets as part of that rebalancing is important. Again, it reduces the demand on land and on water. Again, it has the ability in terms of efficient calorific conversion to reduce the climate impacts. And also from an individual perspective, helps broaden the diet and build a more nutritious proposition. And for businesses, how they can engage in that, two straightforward, I would argue, but significant propositions. One is reformulation. Clearly that can be easy, it can be challenging, but thinking about how you can reformulate existing recipes. And then the second one is portfolio. So, you know, how do you extend and rethink your portfolio to rebalance your offering? And then the final one is regenerative agriculture, nature positive agriculture. And I think there's a few elements. Clearly, as larger businesses, we can help support those farmers and land managers within our own supply chains, both in terms of advice, in terms of networking, but also the reality is, yeah, we're pushing against cultural trends, cultural norms. So we need to help fund that transition, help those farmers get through or over those initial bumps in the road, so we can get to a higher yield, more resilient, nature positive, regenerative agricultural system. The other key thing to really think about is we tend to focus on the food system as purely producing food. Yes. And the really important element is to think about the landscapes within which we operate and thinking about our farmers and our land managers, not just as producers of food, but those individuals who can deliver a range of other ecosystem services. The benefit of that is it provides a much more balanced way of thinking about the proposition, but it also enables those farmers and land managers to take advantage of selling those services to a whole range of other sectors, whether it be water utilities, whether it be housing, linear infrastructure. The benefits of that is it enables us to drive much more efficiency. It de-risks the funding proposition for business. And really importantly, it drives more funding into those landscapes to enable transformation to take place, but also again to build real community resilience as well. And ultimately, the really big one is collaboration. Yeah, thinking about how we work together, how we support actors within our value chain, but also about how we operate or work with other operators and interests within the landscapes within which we operate.
Thank you. I was just going to ask you, because it is really a team effort. It is really a collaboration. If you think about landscape level cooperation, that would be one sort of geographic specific or location specific form of cooperation. But then you also have it with or among different actors in the value chain or different actors in society, the relationship between consumers and producers and retailers, for example. So many opportunities for different combinations of key actors in the food system to come together. Talking about that, and going back to the food waste question, Asani, if I can ask you, we always think about it, and I'm very pleased that Andy has also mentioned it in terms of in the context of the value chain, but we often think about it food waste, which is a very important part, household level food waste management. But if we look at in the context of the work that Agro is doing and the Green Revolution and those investments in the production side, what are some of the opportunities and challenges that you see in terms of reducing food loss?
Great. I hope you can hear me better now. I'm having a bit of challenges with my connectivity. Yep. So thumbs up if you can hear me. Yep. Great. Well, I mean, yeah, reducing food waste at the system level really requires that we approach it in a holistic manner, and particularly for business to see it as an opportunity rather than that just has to be done. Joyce mentioned earlier putting figures and measuring issues, and one of the key things that we found that is really difficult to do is measuring the value of food waste across the value chain. And business sits in a very interesting position that is actually present in almost all processes from production all the way to the time it gets to our plates. And they have an opportunity to mine information. Ruth spoke about the $500 a year farmers lose in the rice value chain due to various inefficiencies. And this has been, an exercise that has taken place. I think business has mined this information and brought this out. So through this learning process, we're able to feed this information to a learning process, a policy development process, and that helps all of us understand the immense opportunities that are there within the food system to reduce food waste and losses. And I think when you look at it from a perspective of building a sustainable business, building a food system that is poverty, we start to see waste, reducing waste as much value as possible through the process. A system issue from the perspective of bringing people into the food system. Inclusivity, what I mean here. We've seen a lot of innovation from young people about how they bring computer or phone applications into bringing markets to doorsteps. That all contributes to the issue of reducing food waste. From the aspect of improving diets as well, a healthy population is good for business, a healthy population is good for the environment, because these are the people who ultimately have to rely on the natural resources for their livelihoods. And if they are not able to take care of themselves through their normal agriculture and food livelihood, they will end up destroying the environment. So from a systemic point of view, I think we need to embrace the fact that we need to encourage partnerships to draw investments, draw data and information that feeds back into a food system for us to be able to fix this broken food system. Thank you.
And picking up on the point around collaboration, what are the things that you are dependent on to be able to realize that? Are there particular infrastructure asks or service asks also from, for example, governments or local authorities that will also help to accelerate these kind of actions?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a number of layers in which we can, promote collaboration. I work in Agra, for example. We've been using a consortium model, which brings different parties. We do a mapping exercise with different partners that feed into an agriculture system. This fosters collaboration because we all come to the same table and see value in each other's work and how it fits into others. From a policy perspective, again, through setting of national targets, we've seen organizations come up and set ambitious targets around reduction of food waste and losses. I think France was one of the few that brought in the idea of not throwing away food that's just approaching the best before. That brought in organizations that work with charity, work with areas that can reprocess, repackage and reprocess that food. So at a policy level, the right incentives, the right platform for us to engage with each other will promote collaboration for us to reduce food waste.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very useful. Ruth, when you mobilize your members, the companies that you engage, what is your sales pitch? What are the benefits of moving early, of taking the leap, of early action?
Sure, thanks, Corley. I think Andy has done a really great job already of talking about some of the business benefits, but maybe I can bring a few to life from a kind of WBCSD perspective. I guess at a very high level, we'd frame the kind of business case around commercial, operational, strategic, and of course, reputational benefits. But what does that mean in reality? So security of supply, of course, is really key. And yes, from an environmental and regenerative ag perspective, but also one of the problems that our CEOs kind of came together and identified and said kept them awake at night was the migration of small farmers out of rural areas into urban areas. The concerns around the viability of a small farmer model, the concerns around whether these farmers are able to access and build a decent standard of living and living incomes. And that's been a real concern. So I think supporting farmers and their families and their farms to ensure that security of supply now and in the future, so that they don't move away to other types of employment or other different types of non-essential crops is really important. And one thing that we've been doing with some companies recently is really strengthening agri-SMEs who need to be called out more for the critical role they play in off-taking from small farmers and often being embedded, of course, in the value chains of big companies. And in fact, we're delighted to have worked a bit with some of Hassan's colleagues on agri-SME finance and trying to better provide a space for agri-SMEs embedded in the value chains of our bigger member companies to access sources of debt equity and grants. And I think that also points to, of course, the need for us to proactively drive more equitable value distribution and the role of SMEs and strengthening them in terms of that. Other examples are, of course, the kind of thought leadership and accounting on the true value of food. We've already discussed that, but we need to far better reflect, yes, the cost, but also the contribution that food makes to that sweet spot between health, environment, and kind of social development. I think stronger sustainability performance is a real opportunity. You know, there's a plethora of different types of frameworks and benchmarks. You know, the World Benchmarking Alliance is about to publish their scorecard. We're all, I'm sure, familiar with the Oxfam's Behind the Brands campaign. And, you know, recognition of improvements that companies are making on some of these salient issues is really key. You know, we've published, for example, a toolkit on agribusiness and human rights that speaks very much to the 6 steps identified in the guiding principles. And we're doing training now to help companies really better understand what strengthening policy and practice on the human rights agenda can really look like and what the benefits and value add are for them and their stakeholders. And just going back to a couple of the points I know we've made around regenerative farming practices, it's an obvious point, but if we need and if we're encouraging farmers to implement more sustainable or even regenerative farming ag practices, we need to make sure, of course, that those do drive increased incomes and stronger livelihoods. Because Andy, I think, mentioned, you know, that might come in the short term at a cost, and we might need to expect a drop in output or a drop in return as we shift onto a far more regenerative and sustainable pathway. I think, of course, another key driver for companies to really take leadership on this agenda is to meet the expectation and requirement of buyers who are in part themselves, of course, responding to consumer changes in consumer demands, changes in investor demands. So there are a whole suite of risks and opportunities that can be woven together to create quite a compelling case for urgent action.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Very compelling. And thank you also for touching on sort of the benchmarks and the standards. I want to recognize there's a comment in the chat also, and that is a whole bundle of work, depending on the particular supply chain or the particular region that you're producing in setting those standards and everything that goes with it in terms of the verification, the information flows around it, the data. So also really important work. One of the chats that was posted is taking us to a completely different corner of the food system, and that's around packaging. So just a quick look for volunteers on packaging, and then we can probably start to wrap up. I want to ask you about your expectations for the food system, but any volunteers on packaging? I'm sure Andy would volunteer.
Yeah, very happy to do so. So it is crucial, and I think one of the really important points, it goes back to an earlier point I was making, is when organisations look at the food system, there is a tendency to take a silo-based approach, and we really need to apply that systems thinking and consider all of those different interconnections. And packaging is one of those crucial ones. So it clearly has a really important role to play in terms of product protection, food safety, and also helping to reduce food loss and waste. But similarly, you know, we're very aware, or many businesses are very aware of the adverse implications of the kind of single-use plastics that have been used before. So what's really important again is that businesses themselves take action. So looking at alternative materials and where we can transition to those alternative materials, doing so and doing it quickly. The same with all of these challenges. You know, it's not about 2050, it really is about taking action now. So as a business, you know, Nestle is very focused on addressing its plastic challenges by 2025. So the first one is looking at alternative materials, looking at alternative delivery opportunities. So whether that's dispensing units, looking at reusable units where we can to help reduce that impact, but also considering the implications of logistics that sit around that. And then ultimately, wherever possible, just reducing the need for packaging as a whole. So trying to reduce, whether it be lightweighting or whether it be ideally eliminating the need for packaging altogether, but again, on the basis of not putting at risk the food safety or the longevity of some of those food products.
Yes, yeah, and those are really important considerations with perishable products that we are dealing with in the food system. Final question in terms of next week's UN Food Systems Summit. What are your expectations? What would you like to see come out of that? And if I can start with you, Ruth, going to do it in reverse order.
Okay, thank you, Corley. One thing that we haven't touched on in this discussion, which I guess is quite surprising in a sense, is the role of the finance sector. Yeah. And I know that the summit has been convening through the finance network, for example, and the finance lever, a lot of expertise and insight and energy and momentum from and around the finance sector and the critical role they play in, you know, really driving investment to the kind of food system transformation activities that we really need to see. Specifically, I think my call or my desire or hope to see come in and out of the summit would, of course, be the continued momentum around the coalition of action on decent work, living incomes and living wages that I mentioned. We're really calling for more member state leadership and engagement in that. It's got a draft work plan that points to the need to act on the very systemic challenges that include, of course, social protection, social welfare, and many of the agendas where, you know, governments have a leading role to play. So I really hope that we can see more momentum and clarity and energy across all different kinds of actors come behind living incomes and wages. It's got an extremely bold and ambitious goal of achieving living wages and incomes for 100% of food system workers by 2030. So that can only ever be realised if we all work collectively, build trust between the different actors and coalesce around these proven levers for action, which do exist and have come from incredible sources, not our own, like the Farmer Incomes Lab, the Community of Practice on Living Incomes, amazing wealth of expertise and input that we're trying to draw from and build on. But that would be a specific call out and hope for next week's summit.
And thank you very much for raising the role of the finance sector and financial institutions and investors. And there's a much greater expectation and articulation of the need to move capital to places where we can create better outcomes for people and nature. And as you are aware, there are sort of processes underway to look at the metrics or what does it mean, but definitely that articulation and I think that longer term policy objective have been clearly articulated. Incredibly important part of moving the entire system is also making sure that the money flows in the right way. Hassan, from your point of view, your perspective, what would you like to see coming out of the Food System Summit?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Corey, for that. Just before I touch on the issue of the Food System Summit, I have packaging very quickly that how we label packaging contribute to quite more responsive. On the summit itself, you know, coming up next week, I think this my boss constantly reminds us that this is a people summit, and my interpretation that what she means summit is that, you know, the majority of the people that produce the food are actually the ones that consume. These are the same people that rarely have access to this food. So my call is for people to come together and not only discuss it happen that the biggest private sector, or the farmers, actually have access to healthy, nutritious food, like other people have. So my call is for business to come together, for academicians to come together, and actually find solutions to bring in the majority of the people that are out there that still go hungry, but yet feed them, to have access to healthy, nutritious food. It is possible, and I think we have resources and the people to do it. That's my call for next week.
Thank you very much. Andy.
Yeah, probably two elements for me. So one, building very much on Ruth's point around green finance. There's obviously a lot of focus on green finance, and it's critically important. Sometimes perhaps there's a tendency to focus on green finance in terms of institutional investment. I think one of the really key elements to think about is green commerce, how we can structure those green commerce systems to both support the local farmers, but also enable green finance, the institutional investment side, to really build around that and gain the scale that we need to see. So that's one core element. So the linkage between green commerce and green finance. The second one, and perhaps aligned to Hassan's point, we hear a lot of talk about collaboration, but to a large extent, a lot of the collaboration perhaps still tends to sit in the shared ambition or individual action area. For me, really looking at how collectively we can develop the frameworks through the Food Systems Summit to support genuine collaborative action on the ground within the communities and landscapes that we operate.
Thank you. And I think there's a great appetite and intent post-summit to also really mobilize and activate these kind of networks at the country level. So that would be one of the opportunities, I suppose, for many businesses that may not have already engaged in this agenda to link into initiatives that's happening at the national level. So it doesn't, it should not all hover at the global level. I think the sooner that we can really bring it to practical site-specific or location-specific areas and foster that collaboration, that will help us also to get more parts of the system to move. And while we will have early adopters, I'm very mindful that the rest of the change curve is a very big bubble of companies and actors and governments and policymakers that all can contribute to this opportunity and the transformation of the food system. So, I mean, thank you very much for your feedback. Thank you for articulating sort of your views, your perspectives, those important, incredibly important ambitions, the bold ambitions around the social dimensions. Thank you very much, Ruth, for that. I think it's really important to bring the social dimension so squarely into this conversation, not only in terms of the inequality, in terms of access. I think that many of us have dealt with, but the parts around the income and living wages, and how do we create those socially resilient, sustainable supply chains, a really important point to bring to the discussion also. With that, thank you so much for all of your contributions, and all of the best. Good luck, bon courage, I wanted to say, but I wasn't sure whether I should say that. Bon courage with your challenges and taking early action on this transformation of the food system. And thank you, of course, for your contribution to the business brief, which we can now consider formally launched. Thank you very much.